Okay, so after a brief intermission, missing last class, I put an announcement up on Canvas about how we're going to proceed. So we're just going to pick up where we left off today, and then I'll post an additional video after class today that kind of goes through some of the material that I was hoping we would get to this week. I also pushed the homework due date instead of the end of the day tomorrow, basically just before class starts on Tuesday. So I'll give you a few more extra days. If you want to turn in a hard copy, this kind of goes for every future homework assignment. If you want to turn it in class, like a hard copy of it, that's fine. So if you want to turn in a hard copy, when you get to class on Tuesday, I'm okay with that. But, if you ever want to, let's say it's due Friday and our last class is Thursday and you don't have it all done, you can always kind of upload it onto Canvas as well. So it doesn't have to be turned in as a hard copy, but if you want to, you can always do that in class. Or, if you stop by my office before it's due, okay? And if I'm not there and that's ever the case, you can kind of slide it under the door. So where did we leave? So we've got this week's lecture slides here. Oh, I also wanted to mention something before I forget. It's kind of a neat event. It's going on tomorrow from 2 to 3. There's a kind of Facebook Live link here. I'll put this up on Canvas as like it'll look like a picture file. But the CEO of Sun King is going to be talking. I think that's kind of specifically about how they got kind of a partnership with Wendy's. Just kind of an interesting. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of the marketing side to it, but I'm sure he'll bring up a lot of different topics that will interest kind of anyone of any major. So I just want to make sure that you guys are aware of that if you hadn't heard of it. I would think it would be pretty interesting. I'll probably actually, I won't talk during it, but I'll probably have it pulled up as I'm working on things and listen to him talk. I think it'll be relatively pretty interesting there. So I'll put that up on Canvas too, just as a reminder, and so you kind of have that link. So last class, we started to talk a little bit about why teams, if they stayed in the current city they're in, the opportunity cost was essentially what they could make in the next best city, right? And so really, ideally, teams are going to want local monopolies wherever they move to, right? If I'm thinking about NFL football games, no one team has a monopoly over NFL football games, but they might have local monopolies for NFL football games within their region, right? So if we're thinking about teams that might move into the same market, right? They're still going to be playing NFL football games, but each one's going to be differentiated a little bit, right? Because they're two different teams, different fan bases, and so they are sharing demand for the overall sport. However, there is going to be some individualized demand for their specific team, okay? So the idea is, why do they want to be local monopolies? And we'll go over this a little more in detail. I'm going to do some surplus stuff today. But the idea is that we know monopolies can charge a higher price. They can actually earn higher profits in a perfectly competitive market. So why do we see some cities have multiple teams? So why do you think New York or LA is able to have two teams? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, their populations are so much larger than a lot of these other cities that they have enough demand that even if they're competing with each other, they can earn higher profits in that market than if they went to Green Bay. And I pick on Green Bay because it's a smaller market. Right? And so if we had a large enough population kind of increasing that demand curve high enough for that sport or that product, well then yeah, two teams might find it optimal to share that demand as opposed to go to a city where they'll be the only team but face a much smaller demand curve. A demand curve that'd be smaller than even half of LA or half of New York, okay? And leagues realize that even with these larger markets, for the league itself, if these teams could move to a different city and become a local monopoly there, potentially, if the team's making a suboptimal decision, the league would like to kind of expand across as wide of a market as possible, right? And so the league wants to kind of protect existing teams in certain locations and prevent kind of multiple teams being in the same location and having to share that demand curve, but also competing with each other, which the more competition we have drives that price down, right? So monopolies can charge a higher price because essentially there's no competition. The more competition we have, that price, you know, how much higher they can set that price starts to fall, okay? So, you know, I think it's a little bit different for these leagues. I kind of summarized it with one bullet point here, but for the most part, you know, 75 miles, I think, like I said, I think it's a little bit different for some of the leagues. But basically, if you want to choose a location that's within a certain radius of a current team, these leagues all have penalties set up, right? So I think I've got a couple examples. The last time we saw, I think this is the last one. Trying to think, there shouldn't be any other current moves to different cities in Major League Baseball. But when the Washington Nationals moved to Washington, they had to pay Baltimore $75 million because they were in a certain radius, right? And we're thinking about there will now be some crossover in those two markets, right? And they might have to start competing with each other. But the Washington Nationals looked at that and said, well, this city has such a high enough demand curve that we're okay paying this additional cost. It's still the best option, essentially, right? So anytime we see these teams move to a location where they have to pay a penalty, it must be that there was like a lot of untapped demand there, right? Because they're willing to pay this penalty because they think they can earn higher profits in the future to kind of compensate or to overcome those additional costs. The Rams and the Chargers, and this one, I've tried to get a real good idea about the exact amount they paid, and I've seen a couple different numbers, but they're all around this range, that when the Rams and Chargers both made a simultaneous decision to move to LA, the league actually made both of them pay a penalty, and it's not this much each team. I think it was this much in total, each of the teams paid. So the league really didn't want two teams to move to LA. They probably wanted one team to move to LA, and if one of the other teams wanted to move somewhere else, they would have preferred that, right? Trying to expand the market and not have this competition drive, kind of cut into profits there. So those are some examples of some of the penalties. You'd probably look up some of the other leagues. If you're interested in a specific move, you could probably, if you just Google that move and penalty, I'm sure you could find what that team had to pay. Like I said, I think it's a little bit different in the NHL and a little bit different in the NBA, but there haven't been like any current NBA moves that have been within a certain radius of another team. So we don't have any recent kind of evidence of that. So, if we look across, I don't know, I think I took like the top 10 cities here, and I'll post an Excel file up, maybe for some of your projects, you might start to get interested in this, like the number of teams that each one of these cities have. And you can kind of think about, we mentioned New York and LA, high demand, not just for any one sport, but probably across all sports. So we're looking at the total number of teams that they have, it's pretty high, right? As we kind of go down, you can start to see these numbers fall, and really outside of these three, top three cities, none of these major sports have more than one team located within it. Okay? One team within each league, right? You can think about, it might be optimal for certain leagues if they compete with each other, and you can't see this from the top 10, but as we work our way down, if the WNBA is worried about competing with NBA teams, we might see WNBA teams not locate as often in big cities like Philadelphia or Houston or Miami, because they don't want to compete with existing NBA teams. Right? They don't want to have that competition. So we might see them end up in smaller cities that don't have an NBA team. I'm not real well versed in the WNBA. I know there's a few where they're located, I think maybe like Portland or something like that, where, or not Portland's a bad example. What would it be? Seattle. I think there's one in Seattle, but there's not currently an NBA team there. So they might start to choose these cities where they don't have to compete with another league, right? If their products are similar enough. So that was, I think, we kind of ended off on a thing that was related to team location. We really kind of switched gears a little bit here, briefly talk about something that's interesting when we're thinking about the differences between teams and league decisions. So we talked a little bit about like local broadcast. Some leagues allow local broadcast deals. The others make all of the deals themselves, kind of like the NFL. So if we're thinking about something, not broadcast kind of deals here, but something else where the league might have different incentives than kind of individual teams, let's talk about league advertising. Okay? So League-wide advertising, we kind of think about as a public good. If the NBA puts out something, some ad or just about the NBA product, right? Oh, the NBA is going to be, I don't know, on this network every Friday or something like that, right? They're just promoting the general product, not one team individually, right? You can think of that as a public good where every single team is going to benefit from that league-wide advertising, right? As long as people are being drawn to just the NBA, well, that could benefit every single team within the NBA. If you go back to kind of your 201, thinking about this is non-rival, right? Multiple teams can enjoy that league-wide or benefit from that league-wide advertising, and it's non-exclusionary. Once the NBA puts it out there, every team is going to benefit from that, right? There's no way we could prevent them from benefiting once that ad is put out there, or that promotion. However, you could think about what teams are going to might benefit more from that league-wide advertising. Well, if it just raises the demand for the NBA product, then if I'm in a location that just has more people, I'm going to benefit more people who are willing and able to purchase my product. So we can think about even league-wide advertising could benefit large market teams more than small market teams. So what you could do, right, the league doesn't want to charge every single team the exact same amount because they know that the New York teams are going to benefit more than the Indianapolis teams, right? So what you could try to do is charge teams exactly how much they'll benefit in order to pay for this league-wide promotion. Now that's kind of difficult to do, but what's maybe one thing I could base how much I charge teams, I could use something to base that off of, try to capture that I'll charge large market teams more. I can maybe look at their ticket sales, right? I can maybe look at total revenue from ticket sales, right? Not just the number, but number times price, probably a better way of doing it, right? I could use some measure of their revenue to try to charge them exactly how much they'll benefit. So that's one solution. Now, the other problem is it always is going to benefit teams to not pay in as much. So if I know the league starts to base how much I'm paying in off of different revenue sources, what might I be likely to do if they're asking me about how much I made? If you know that how much you pay is going to be directly linked to your revenues, what might I be more incentivized to do when I'm asked about those revenues? Lie, right? Or underreport, right? Maybe cook the books a little bit to make it look like I'm earning less than I am, right? So that's the free rider problem, right? I'm going to get to enjoy the benefits no matter how much I pay in, right? If everybody else pays in and I report that I have zero revenue, well, I'm still going to benefit from that league-wide promotion and I didn't have to pay in anything, right? So we have this free rider problem where teams will understate, right? Whatever it is, however the league bases this off of, right? Whether it's ticket revenue or whatever source of revenue or profits they're going to try to base it off of. Which, if every team has the incentive to understate, then each team is going to pay in a lower amount. And what happens to the overall amount spent on league-wide promotion? It goes down, which means the benefits also go down, right? They don't get as many ads out there. They're not able to promote this at the level it would have been if teams would have paid in exactly how much they should have, and they didn't understate kind of whatever their revenues were. Okay? I think might have another bullet. So, ideally we could do this based off of revenue, but we do know these free rider problems exist. So unless the league is not asking the teams for the information and then maybe able to collect the information independently, some of them will just kind of resort to, we'll just charge every team an equal share, right? Especially if it's some type of promotion they don't think is going to vary with market size, they might go with the equal share to avoid this free rider problem that exists if it's mandated it's based off of some other revenue source. With that in mind, right, let's think about maybe a numerical example of exactly how league-wide advertising could be better for the league and as opposed to letting every team do it individually. So let's say we have this example where The intercept for an ad for small market teams is at the $10,000 mark. For large market teams, it's at 20,000. And we have 15 of each type, right? We're going to make this easy, an equal number of each type. So, and we also can think about as each ad is run, every single team, like the value of that ad falls by $1,000, right? So I guess here we can think about the very first ad, right? With, you know, the marginal benefit, the first ad, well, it decreases by 1,000, so 10,000 minus 1 times 1,000, so $9,000, right? But for the large market team, it'd be 20,000 minus that 1,000. So let's see, I did this last class. I'm gonna try to do something simultaneously here. New share, no, same share. And you don't have to look at me anymore. So we'll see if this works here. You guys still have to look at me, but the people on Zoom don't have to if this works. There we go. I realize this might be a little small for those of us who are kind of in here in class. I'll zoom in on it after the fact. I just want to make sure we have the slides here to kind of make this corollary. So we were saying that for the small market teams, let's see if the light's not too bad. We could think about their demand started at 10,000 and it fell by 1,000. And I'll kind of write Q of A here, so the quantity of ads, right? For each additional ad we run, that value, right? If we're thinking about this represents our demand curve, our marginal benefit, it falls by 1,000. Let me see here. I auto-focused it earlier, but I get the light's not perfect. Okay. So this was for our small market teams, and then for our large market teams, the only difference was that intercept was up at 20,000. We can kind of think about multiplying that there. Okay. Everybody see that okay in the back? That's probably a little bit small. I'll switch to this once we're done here. So that was basically from the information I just had there. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is stop this share. So maybe we can see it's a little bit bigger. Okay. So that's what we got from the information that we were given. Let me see if I can do this right. Oh, that focused a little bit better. So if I wanted to draw this out, I put the quantity of ads on my x-axis here, and I can think about price, or just want to represent this as I think about this as a dollar amount up on my y-axis. For the small market teams, it's going to start at what, 10,000 or 10K. I'm going to shorthand that, and then it's going to fall 1,000 for each additional ad that I sell. So I could actually even think about where is the intercept going to be here on the x-axis? At what quantity would I get a price for the ad of 0 for small market teams? 10. I saw someone holding it up. Right? If I went to 10 here, 10 times 1,000 is 10,000. 10,000 minus 10,000 will be the point at which that hits 0. Okay? For a large market team, we have a higher intercept. And if we do the math here, at what quantity would that equal 0? 20. And this is where I made a mistake because I forgot to look at what the cost of an ad was. Let's see if I can remember what I said it was in the, is it, I believe it's, I'm not going to remember what it is. Let me switch back real quick. $150,000, all right? Sorry about that. So each ad, if the league was going to do this league-wide promotion, or really if any one team wanted to kind of pay for one ad, it's going to be at $150,000 each ad. We'll just assume it's constant. Well, where would that be on my graph? Way up here, right? So, I mean, I'll draw it as though it's up here, but it's even higher, right? So if I think about this as kind of my additional cost of an ad or my marginal cost was at 150, well, any team, right? These were individual teams' demand curves, right? Will any team even buy one ad No, right? I mean, this cost is way above even the very first incremental marginal benefit that they would get. Right? So we have a problem. If we don't do league-wide advertising here, there's going to be 0 ads out there. Right? So what can we do? Okay. Well, we can think about if we allow the league to make decisions. Okay. And we start out with 15 of each teams, then let's say the league did 1 league-wide ad. What would the benefit be, right? Well, 15 teams, right? We could think about here's each one of their individual marginal benefits. So I could just take this and multiply it by 15. The other 15 teams will have this marginal benefit. So I take this and multiply it by 15. So if I think about kind of my demand curve for the league, where I'm writing this as kind of price, I would basically take 15 times 10,000 minus 1,000 times the quantity, and then add to that 15 times 20,000 minus 1,000 times the quantity of ads I sell, or ads I buy, right? So if I do the math here, I believe I'm doing this correctly in my head, and I've set these numbers up ahead of time, correct? Right? We end up with a league-wide demand curve that looks something like this. Okay. Oh. You can see that okay? Is everyone able to see that okay? On Zoom too, if you're having problems, let me know, make sure you ask a question. Are we okay with that? So we're basically just taking, right, we've got 15 of each types of teams. So we're gonna have each team's benefiting this much times 15, right? Because there's 15 of those types of teams. So now, I'm gonna slide this up. Now if we think about league-wide demand, make sure that everything's on here. Think about price or just kind of dollars up here. Well now, where's my league-wide intercept? 450,000. Right, I've got some demand curve that slopes downward there. I think if I'm looking at this right, I think the intercept would be 15 here, right? If I plug 15 in here times 30,000, it would kind of give me that price of 0. Now you don't have to find that point, but just kind of discuss, talking through these things. And we said the cost of each ad, right, maybe to buy the broadcast rights for a, 2-minute ad, I don't know how long the ads are, was $150,000. Okay. And now this is actually this isn't a wild assumption that marginal cost is constant, in that if I go out and try to buy a 1-minute time slot, it's probably going to cost me, the same value of a 1 minute, like let's say it's the same program, it probably does cost me about the same amount. If I buy 2, they're not going to upcharge me more for the second one. So this is a pretty reasonable thing when we're thinking about advertising to have these constant marginal costs. Okay. So now basically what I want to do is solve for the point where the marginal cost of the last ad purchased is equal to the marginal benefit to the league of that last ad purchased. Okay. So how can I do that? Well, I've got my demand equation up here. I know that marginal cost, no matter what the quantity is just 150,000. So I set this marginal cost curve of 150,000. Equal to that demand curve of 450,000 minus 30,000 times the quantity of ads. And now it's just a little bit of algebra, right? I've got one equation, one unknown. I can work this out to solve for that quantity of the number of ads. Okay. So, I guess I can do some of the algebra for you. I'll do it real quick. Pretty quick and dirty algebra here. So I'll subtract 150 from both sides, and I'll be left with, what, 300,000 minus 30,000 Q of A. I'll move this over to that side. So I've got 30,000 times the quantity of A equals 300,000. Divide both sides by 30,000. and I get the quantity of ads that's optimal for the league. Is that on there? Yeah, is 10. Okay. So like I said, once we got to setting that marginal cost equal to the marginal benefit, our demand curve for ads for the league, there's just a little bit of algebra to solve for that optimal number of ads for the league was 10. Right? Now this is an interesting point, like it is a public good. Public goods we typically think about, you know, in a non-sports example would be something like national defense. None of us can afford to, you know, whatever units you want to put national defense in, we can't purchase the first unit individually. Maybe Bezos or someone could, but for the most part, no one person could support that, right? Now, if collectively we pay taxes and put our money together, well, maybe then we can start to be able to supply this national defense, which everybody benefits from. Same idea here, right? When we went back originally, if I can get this to autofocus a little bit better here. Let me see. Just trying to do something. Oh, that's not better. There we go. Right, originally we said, still not great. Right, my marginal cost curve was way up here, and so there was no ads being purchased if we let the teams make the decisions individually. Whereas once we switch to letting the league buy ads for the entire league and everybody can benefit from those, we actually see the optimal number that for the league would be 10. So we went from 0 league-wide to 10, right? And you can imagine in a really extreme scenario, maybe if instead of we had like just large and small market, we actually looked at every individual city. New York and LA teams maybe purchase 1 or 2 ads for themselves, right? However, none of the other teams can afford it. However, if the league does the advertising, instead of just seeing those 1 or 2 ads across the league might be able to afford something like 10 or 12 or whatever the optimal number ends up being. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. Let's see if this helps. If I turn this on, an autofocus, is that going to do anything to it for us? No. It blows my mind how it's like so variable from class to class. Sometimes it looks good and sometimes it doesn't. So let's go back. There we go. Cool. So we worked through that example. Next thing, I think we have 45 minutes. I might save this for the video. I might record kind of and throw it in at the end, or if we have time, we'll come back to it. So we'll skip kind of these few slides here because I want to make sure we are able to think about monopoly and deadweight loss and relate it to some of the things that we've talked about in the past. Okay? So if we think about a market where a monopoly exists, right? And this is just general, not necessarily specific to some of the models we've looked at, but just a general market. I've got increasing marginal cost. I face this demand curve, and I've got a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Now, because I'm a monopoly, right, the whole supply curve is just my marginal cost curve. My marginal cost curve dictates how much I supply to the market, and there's nobody else involved, right? I'm the only firm. So generally, we think about if this was a perfectly competitive market, that's what I've identified as QC here. Probably should have had a PC, but a competitive market. Producer surplus is going to be basically adding up the surplus that exists for every unit I sell, the difference between the price I was able to sell it for, like how much money my firm was taking in, and the additional cost it took to produce that unit. So we could think about producer surplus would be this like lower rectangle, the area above marginal cost, but below the price, right? However, with a monopolist, they choose a lower quantity and set this higher price. So now producer surplus is the area under the price that they receive and then down to and above that marginal cost curve. Okay? So you can kind of see for producer surplus before, we had this entire lower triangle here. So what we lose out on with a monopolist is this little area here. However, the producers gain this surplus amount from there. Now for consumer surplus, that's the difference between how much I value that good. Remember we said demand represents marginal benefit, right? So it's how much I'm benefiting from buying those additional quantities, the difference between that and the price I pay. So for a perfectly competitive market, it's the area above the perfectly competitive price, but below my demand curve, so this upper triangle here. However, with a monopolist, I'm paying a higher price, I'm buying less, so these people no longer are purchasing the good, so consumers lose out here. And then part of consumer surplus was converted to, sorry, I said it right. Part of consumer surplus was converted to producer surplus here. And now consumer surplus, we're left with a much smaller area. Right? So, when we have a monopoly, a market with a monopolist in it, what we lose out on is this area right here. Because if it was perfectly competitive, we would have been seeing that as surplus. Part of it was producer and part of it was consumer surplus, but it was surplus that now that we have monopolists, we're losing out on. And that's essentially because monopolists choose to provide a lower quantity to the market, and these people are no longer able to purchase the good, or we're no longer selling those goods. So we lose out on this little triangle. We call that deadweight loss, right? It's what would have been surplus in a perfectly competitive market, but no longer is. Okay? Kind of reviewing the consumer surplus there. Any questions on that? I know I went through it a little bit quick. I'll show you another example where we'll look at, we'll actually think about this in the ticket market, which will be a little bit different, but this is the general kind of market. Okay? So if we think about monopolies that exist in sport, right? We think about the relationship between when we have perfectly competitive versus a monopolist, prices are going to be higher, right? The equilibrium prices for monopolists are higher, which is kind of what we see here. Here's the perfectly competitive price. Here's the price the monopolist charges. We're going to have a lower quantity with monopolists. I kind of already pointed that out previously, right? However, when we look at the ticket market, this may not always be true. So we'll look and see how, we have this general effects of a monopolist in the market, but the ticket market operates a little bit differently, right? So, hopefully, the desire of being a monopolist is that you experience greater profits because you are able to kind of charge this higher price. Right? Now, if I'm earning profits where I would have otherwise not because the market would otherwise be competitive, I might pay to keep other people out. Right? This is called rent-seeking behavior. This doesn't apply too much to us, but we think about how much money would these teams be willing to spend, right? Well, it's essentially they'd spend all of their profits up to the point where profits were just above zero, because in a perfectly competitive market, in the long run, profits for firms are zero. Okay? So probably a pretty sizable amount of money if you're willing to pay, all of your profits right up to the point where you're just above zero, because if you're not a monopolist, your profits are zero. Right? So the leagues would be willing to pay a pretty large amount. Basically, the difference between what their profits would be in a perfectly competitive market, which we know should be zero, and how much they're earning currently, right? So I don't want to waste too much time on this, but if we think about, it's not just then that we have this deadweight loss existing in the market, we also have additional resources spent to maintain that monopoly status that kind of lose resources could have been used for something else, right? So we're kind of losing out multiple directions, right? I think here I've got two blank slides. I want to go through the ticket price one first, and then I'll kind of talk about how monopolies work when we're looking at the win market as well. So the first one we'll look at here is a ticket market. So I'm going to do blue here I'll try to do it in black. I can tell it's running out, but maybe we'll be able to. So let's say I've got my quantity of tickets here on my x-axis. Okay? And I've got, when you think about the price of those tickets up there on the y-axis. Okay? Now we said there's some demand curve, right, which represents marginal benefit, purchasing these different numbers of tickets, but there's also a supply curve that runs along the x-axis up to the point, right? Where we meet capacity, okay? So, let's say we had a perfectly competitive market. This represents our supplier marginal cost curve. The optimal quantity would be right here, right? Where supply and demand intersect, or marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost, right? So we'll think about this as maybe Q perfectly competitive, price we charge, be right here. Okay? What area would be total surplus here? Well, if we think about for the producer, it's the area under the price they receive, but above their marginal cost, right? So the profit earned in this ticket market, we can kind of think about, or not profit, sorry, I should say the producer's surplus that exists would be right here, right? This kind of black shaded area. Where would consumer surplus be? Well, it's the area under the demand curve because that's how much they benefit, but above the price they pay. Sorry, not P, this should be CS, right? Consumer surplus. So we've got producer and consumer surplus if we didn't have monopolists in this market. So let's think if we did have a firm that was acting as a monopolist, right? Well, what's going to happen, right? They're now going to be facing this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Okay? Now, what they're going to do potentially, I've drawn this just below it for a reason, right? The optimal point is going to be where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue for a monopolist. So the quantity the monopolist arrives at is slightly lower, right? Just a little bit lower. The price they charge, the way I've drawn it here, is going to be slightly higher. So if this is the scenario where my demand wasn't very, very high, such that my marginal revenue would actually be intersecting on the x-axis, we see a reduction in quantity and an increase in price. That's usually what we see. Right? This isn't anything new. And where's my deadweight loss here? So usually we always think about deadweight loss as a triangle, but here actually, where is it? Well, I've got a little triangle right here that was deadweight loss, but I'm also no longer selling these tickets. So it's like this skinny rectangle and this little triangle up there now represent my deadweight loss. So it's a little bit different than a conventional kind of market that we're looking at because we always think about deadweight loss as this like little triangle that we lost out on. It's just really how much, it's really from the reduction in the quantity of tickets we're selling, we lose out on all of this, right? And now our market kind of has this weird supply curve. So things look a little different. But what could be the case? And I'll try to draw this, but what could be the case? What if demand was a little bit higher, right? And my marginal revenue curve, when it was twice as steep, still intersected that vertical line. If that was the case, what would happen to the quantity? If I had a monopolist. So I'll try to draw this for you here real quick. So let's say we had a slightly higher demand curve. I probably won't label everything quite as in detail as I just did. So let's say we've got our demand curve is up here. Let's say my marginal revenue curve is right here. It's not completely vertical, it's a little bit off, but you get what I'm trying to do here. So I've got this marginal revenue curve. It's going to intersect that supply or marginal cost curve, wherever my capacity is. But notice, what quantity will the monopolist choose? Well, it would be right here. What quantity would the perfectly competitive firm choose? Actually the same thing. And what price would they both charge? They go up to the demand curve. In both situations, the price and the quantity in the ticket market really don't change, right? So when demand is really high, we're actually less concerned with a monopolist in this market because there's no surplus loss here, right? There's absolutely no surplus lost in this situation. right? Now, if we go back, not every team is selling out, right? Hitting capacity for every game. So for all those teams that aren't selling out the capacity, as monopolists, we are experiencing some surplus loss, okay? But it doesn't necessarily have to be the case if demand was high enough to kind of sell out, even for a monopolist in that market, okay? Any questions on that? Part of the issue might be that this marker is dying, that's not picking up these lines quite as easily. Okay? All right, so next let's think about kind of the win market. I'm going to try to do this in blue. So let's say I'm now no longer thinking about tickets, but I'm thinking about how does a monopolist work when we're looking at that win market. So thinking about here, we've got kind of like dollars. And to simplify these models, when we're looking at the win market, I've always kind of kept marginal costs as this identical kind of constant marginal cost. It could be slightly increasing, but we're just going to simplify it for the sake of this discussion. So let's say I've got, I want to show you, so we've got our demand curve, and we have our twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Right? For a perfectly competitive team, right, they're going to choose, or sorry, for a perfectly competitive, for a, if we're thinking about a profit maximizing team, right, they're going to choose the point at which marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Now, this is for a monopolist, right? So kind of think about the number of wins for a monopolist. They're profit maximizing is this point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Now, for society, is that a good thing? Well, you can think about where's the deadweight loss. If we didn't allow the profit maximizing team to make this decision, but we instead said, look, you don't face this marginal cost curve, you don't face this marginal revenue curve, you're not a monopolist. We look at the marginal cost curve, we think about that's essentially representing supply. Perfectly competitive market, equilibriums where supply is equal to demand. So the perfectly competitive number of wins for this team would be somewhere out here. So what we're losing out on is all of this surplus, which we can think about as deadweight loss. Okay. So having a monopolist in this market still impacts kind of the surplus, like we're still seeing surplus lost. Now, what if the team is win maximizing? Why is that a good thing? Not for the team, but for society. Yeah. Yeah, there's no deadweight loss because what happens? A win maximizing team, and I could probably write profit here for the monopolist, even if they are a monopolist, if they're win maximizing, they're going to go all the way out to this point where demand hits marginal cost, and that's the point where profits are equal to zero. So once again, we could see some surplus lost here, right, with a monopoly in this market, but if those teams are win maximizing, we actually end up with back at this perfectly competitive point, okay? And someone brought up a question. I said I was going to answer it on Tuesday, but obviously I wasn't able to do that. Does it get any better if I? Not really. Okay. Any questions on that or any clarification? Like I said, I know this isn't showing up perfectly here. Look at the chat real quick. We're good? Okay. I want to point something else out here because someone asked me this question and it's a pretty good point. So it's still going to be looking at the win market, but it's a little bit different. So I think blue is showing up the best, so let's do that. So let's think about the number of wins or quantity of wins, I think is how I drew it. Either way, you know, we're looking at the number of wins. Dollar up here, let's think about, we got marginal costs. We got our demand curve. And I believe their questioning to me was this idea that when they're making the decision up to the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, this is going to be some optimal number of wins, right? So the question was, at that last win, was the additional profit that they earned actually zero? Because if the additional revenue is equal to the additional costs, that should mean that the additional profit was 0, right? The difference between those two, I added the exact same amount of revenue as what it cost me. And the answer is, I'm drawing these models, to be completely honest, a little bit, I'll say dumbed down, but like we're not making them as complicated as they actually could be. So these look continuous, but when we think about the number of wins, right? And we do say there are a targeted number of wins, but let's say this optimal number of wins was, I don't know, let's think about, we'll do NFL, that's always easier because there's a smaller number of games. Let's think about this as a 10th win, right? That's their targeted number of wins. What was the additional surplus really brought in from that win? Well, what if we had only won 9, right? And we actually would have been at the marginal revenue brought in from that 9th win was up here on that marginal revenue curve. And the marginal revenue, when we look at that 10th win, looks like it's exactly equal to marginal cost, and so profits don't change at all. But how much do we actually add? Well, if we think about we had this curve, it's discrete. You can almost think about it as we still added this amount to profit, right? There was, yes, when we got to this point, the additional profit is 0, but because it's discrete, we're really making jumps from 9 to 10, right? So anything in between here we could think about, there still is some additional profit being derived because marginal revenue is still greater than marginal cost up until we get to that integer value of 10. And we have to make integer jumps, right? So I don't want to do discrete models in this class. You could think about what we've really got here is a demand curve that looks, instead of continuous, it would be something like this. So we would have a marginal revenue point at like the first win and the second win, and right there'd be these gaps, right? That becomes a little bit more complicated, so we're not going to think about those models yet. But think about it's not that there's 0 profits, right? There was still some gain there, some surplus gain. We could think of it as. Okay. Also related to some of the homework, I've been getting some questions. I want to make sure we think about. We have a demand curve, right? And we talked about we can see shifts in demand. But if I asked you for the marginal benefit of, say, I don't know, the 12th win, to find that marginal benefit, you go up to the demand curve and then go over and say, this is how much the team's marginal benefit was, right? So you've got this marginal benefit or this demand curve, but you can find the marginal benefit of that last win, right? By going up and seeing where you're at on that curve. Marginal revenue is the same idea, right? I can see shifts in my marginal revenue curve, but if I think about what was the marginal revenue of the 10th win, right? If it was the last win, the optimum wins they targeted, well, the marginal revenue at that 10th win, I'd go up to the marginal revenue curve and then go over and find that value, right? I don't need to know that value necessarily, but if I'm trying to compare, to a higher demand curve or something like that, I'm thinking about the marginal revenue of the last win is actually a point on the marginal revenue curve, not thinking about whether or not the entire curve is higher or lower. Okay? Does that make sense? Anyone have questions on that? And if the person asked about this idea, email me. I can't remember the name now. If your question wasn't answered, let me know. But I think that should kind of cover that. And the idea is that, okay, there's integer jumps, right? And we usually don't think about that for most products, but here, right, I can't see 9.2 wins. Right? All right. Let's go back here, switch over. All right, so I left those two slides blank. I kind of mentioned here, if we have a situation where because the monopolist is choosing marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, right? Sometimes we can have this scenario where the marginal revenue curve intersects marginal cost at 0, right? So the marginal revenue of that last ticket sold could actually be 0, right? If it was like the first scenario that I drew. We can also sometimes see that teams are actually operating where their marginal revenue is less than 0. So let's think about here. I'll show you this to go along with this slides. And if you're on Zoom, I'm going to start trying to do this more often where I'll have the slides pull up as a screen share, but make sure you have your video popped up because I'll be pointing things out on whatever I've already drawn. So where's the one I drew earlier? This guy right here, right? So when we were at that optimal quantity for monopolist, the marginal revenue and marginal cost were zero, right? But if we looked at and saw some teams are operating where the marginal revenue of their last ticket sold, and we find, well, they're a monopolist, this is their demand and marginal revenue curve, but for some reason, they're still selling to capacity, which actually means their marginal revenue is just slightly negative, right? So why would a team maybe want to do that? If I'm this close to selling out my stadium, right? Why am I just want to continue to sell out tickets even though it's eating into my profits, right? The marginal revenues here are negative. They're less than the marginal cost of zero. Why might I want to operate out to the point where the last tickets I'm selling are actually having a negative marginal revenue? What might be an advantage of having sold out or having like a full capacity stadium? If you're watching a game and you see that like the stands are half empty, it doesn't bode very well for the team, right? And so if they think that potentially their stadium isn't going to be even close to capacity, they may continue to sell tickets at lower and lower prices. Hell, they might even give away tickets, right? Prices that are not at, below zero. They might give away tickets to fill the stadium up, because if the stadium looks more full, potentially that's more attractive when they're trying to sell the rights to that game to local broadcasters, right? Or just the demand for their team that then parlays into things like the apparel market, merchandising. So they may kind of go out to this point where marginal revenue is negative, because yeah, I'll lose some profits in my ticket market, but if that can help me drive up demand, right, for my team, or drive up the demand to broadcast my team's games, maybe I'll make up for those profits in other markets, right? So it's really a much more complicated, like, we can determine the optimal thing to do if the ticket market was like completely unrelated to everything else. But if I believe that the ticket market might have some effects in the other markets where I'm earning revenues, I might do this trade-off where I'll lose money here to gain money elsewhere, right? In broadcast deals or in kind of increased demand and for my apparel or things like that. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? So there's a line of research that actually looks like this. I've kind of already mentioned, right? It's kind of the idea of a loss leader. I'm losing money on one product to make money on others. Okay. Where are we at on time? Okay, so I'll go back to those slides I skipped. No, I like what we're doing. I like the monopoly. I'll cover those in the additional video. So, what if we have a monopolist and they want to employ some strategies to earn even higher profits, right? They're not happy with just experiencing these profits from being monopolists. They want to push it even further. So we'll talk about some different strategies. One would be price discrimination, right? So all price discrimination means is trying to charge consumers exactly how much they value the product, right? So when I set a ticket price, right, maybe I set the price for that ticket at $50. There's some people, right, who would have paid $150 for that ticket. So if I can identify who the people were who would pay $150 and who the people were who would only pay $50, well, now I'm going to be able to sell the same number of tickets, but some of those tickets are going to be selling for $150 instead of the $50, right? So I'll try to charge consumers exactly how much they value that ticket or whatever their marginal benefit is, right? So, if we look at this, a lot of times prices do vary, right? If we're looking at even just tickets, right? Different customers are charged different prices. So what's one thing, I always use college basketball as a good example of this, because there's a stark difference in the contrast, or there's a stark contrast or stark difference in the prices that the general public pays for tickets and the price that students can pay for tickets, especially if you look at the price of season tickets and kind of student season tickets, right? So we're charging different groups kind of different prices because we know their valuation is different, right? The ability of college students to pay for season tickets is much lower than the ability of, CEO or whoever we're looking at to pay. Right? So we see student discounts, we see senior discounts, we see whenever we can find a characteristic that is directly related to how much that person will benefit, their ability and willingness to pay. We want to exploit that characteristic to try to charge those groups higher amounts of money. So students, senior discounts, you know, you might see this. One way that is less conventional to think about this is you're not forcing like everyone to pay this certain price, right? You just may be advertising different prices, right? So sometimes if you think about, you know, different times of the day, there might be different prices. If you think about airline tickets, right? It's the same tickets, but depending on when you purchase them, prices will vary because they know if you're buying tickets a month out, right, you can be a lot more picky than if you have to buy a plane ticket today, right? If you have to get somewhere, you're much more willing and able to pay a higher price today than you were a month prior to your travels. Same kind of idea if you're buying tickets to a game, right? If you want to buy a ticket the day of the game, well, I know you're interested in going to the game, you don't have any other options, you're probably willing to pay a higher price than if you're kind of looking at prices a month out, right? So different times of when people will purchase. You know, I think we can break this down into, you know, more conventional, like we see early bird specials, happy hours. I mentioned the plane example, but you also will see that when we know that there's certain days where demand is lower, where willingness and ability to pay is lower. I'm not as likely to go to a game on a Monday night versus like a Friday or a Saturday. You see a lot of them run these deals for those days they know that are less popular. So it's not that it's necessarily a characteristic about your consumer. It could be a characteristic that's related to kind of the demand for that game. One other thing that this becomes a little bit more possible to do. So let's say I'm looking at, where's one of my ticket markets? Oh, this is my ticket market, right? So let's say I'm thinking about my demand curve for tickets. This person, you know, if I think about this is the quantity of tickets purchased overall for the game, well, this was the person who valued it the highest, this person valued it less, but they're all paying, you know, that monopoly price, right? But these people would have paid a much higher price. So if I can individually identify who these people are, that's great, right? What I could then do is say, charge that person who values the ticket the most, I could charge them this price. The person who values it the second most, charge them that price. All the way down to where, essentially, every single person is paying a price that's exactly equal to their marginal benefit, right? So if I'm able to perfectly price discriminate, I'm actually, if we think about where producer surplus is now, well, now the price that I'm charging is actually my demand curve. And so producer surplus is the area under the price they receive, but above marginal cost. So if I can perfectly price discriminate, I can basically turn all of this surplus into my producer surplus, right? And the way that teams can do this better today is they can collect information from the internet or from other sources to try to get an idea about whether or not that individual would value that game more. And maybe they send targeted ads or targeted deals to those consumers who they know might be willing to pay a higher price, right? And it's very unlikely they can perfectly price discriminate, but that's like what they want to move towards. Okay? All right, so we'll talk about a couple more strategies. So the first one's variable ticket pricing. This is just the idea that if I know there's a factor that drives demand, right? And variable ticket pricing, we think about happening prior to the season, right? So I'm going to look at factors that I know impact my demand curve for these tickets and set different prices. So if I look at weekend games, well, I know the demand curve is higher. So I know that if I think about my general ticket model, higher demand should lead to higher prices, right? So I'm just using these factors to set the price for weekend games higher than the price for weekday games, right? Maybe higher quality opponents. When I look at my schedule before the year starts, I try to maybe set the prices higher when I think I'm going to be facing a higher quality opponent, right? So this is all done prior to the games being played, like prior to the season being played. This is done at the beginning of the year. Now, this is variable ticket pricing. I'm using different variables to set the prices different for different games. Okay? So some good examples we have of this. I always like this one. I'm sure there's other teams that do it, but the hockey team, the Buffalo Sabres, they have these like different, I I guess, metal tiers like platinum, gold, silver, and bronze. And they all kind of represent, the price to go to one of these platinum games, the ticket prices for the same seat are much higher than if you want to buy a ticket to that seat for a bronze valued game, right? So they kind of ahead of the season let you know like which games they think you're going to be more worthwhile to watch, and you're going to have to pay higher prices for those. Right? Which basically that's good, because if before I was just setting one single price, I could have been setting a much higher price for some games, right? But then for other lower quality games, maybe that price was set too high and I actually don't sell any tickets, right? So it's basically just allowing me to set a ticket that more optimally connects with the different characteristics of that game, right? As opposed, because we have to, what this is really taking into consideration is that the same game, right? The same, same team playing a game, well, that the value of that game depends on who the opponent is, what time of the week, what time of the day, and all those things will kind of influence that demand curve. Other examples I always love is if you look at the ticket prices, even for big schools like IU, Duke, like, big basketball schools, if you look at their games over winter break, the ticket prices sometimes will go from like $40, $50 to like literally under $10, right? Because it's winter break for a lot of those. They're still playing in a university town. A lot of their demand has left, right? A lot of their students have left, so they see this huge decrease in their demand curve. Or a lot of people are traveling, even if it's not students, they're traveling around these times. So this is a nice variable ticket pricing we see teams do for college sports, or specifically basketball. Dynamic ticket pricing is going to be the exact same idea. We're going to be using variables, we're going to be using factors that influence the demand curve. It's just that we're doing it kind of on the fly, right? Like the variable ticket pricing is all done. They have those games, the platinum, bronze, silver games already set before one game is played. Dynamic ticket prices is I allow the price for those tickets to change after the season starts, right? So if players have unexpectedly good seasons, a good example of this is maybe in Major League Baseball, where pitchers don't pitch every game. Well, if a pitcher has an unexpectedly good season, maybe I then, for when I know he's going to be starting and playing in that game, I increase my ticket prices, right? Because I know people are more willing to want to come see them pitch, right? So another kind of example, if we could pull up different examples from different sports. I remember kind of the Cowboys prior to the season when Ezekiel Elliott and Dak Prescott were both kind of rookies. Their ticket prices were relatively low at the beginning of the season, and then once they started to perform well, by the end of the season, they started charging a much higher and higher amount for their tickets, right? They just allow these characteristics to kind of update their prices as the season goes on. Injured players, right, might cause me to reduce prices for my ticket games. So that's just another example. And then both these are just strategies to set a better optimal price given the current factors that I know are shifting my demand curve. So if you want to, and I think this is, so if you want to think about variable and dynamic ticket pricing, they're really the same strategy. It's just one of them takes place before anything is started, and the other is once the season gets going, now we use it. So it's really the same strategy. I'm not really sure why they have kind of these two different games. I guess it's just because there's more, different types of situations would apply to you changing the ticket price once the season starts, as opposed to prior to any game being played. They both have kind of the same idea in mind. Okay? And I didn't draw anything here, but it's as simple as all we're thinking about is once we have this ticket market, if something is going to cause demand for a game to be higher, then I should be charging a higher price, right? That's really, it's just it shifts in demand. Okay? And we've already kind of talked about those, so I didn't have a drawing with that. The next one, we got 10 minutes, so I'll probably end here after this topic. But let's think about bundling. Okay? So I'll describe the idea, and then I'll try to give you a toy example of what bundling looks like. Okay? So let's say I've got multiple games I'm playing a season, right? I could sell a ticket individually to each one of those games, right? But I could also pair them or create blocks, right? So it might be that I know I have one game that people are really going to want to go to, and another one that it's going to be hard to sell a single ticket for, right? But we already talked about it's good for some of my other revenue streams to look like I always have a full stadium. So what I might do is kind of package these games where I say, look, I know that someone would be willing to pay a much higher price for game one and a very low price for game two. But if I bundle them together and just charge one price to purchase both of them, it's actually a strategy where I can earn a little bit of additional revenue. Right? So we'll walk through some examples numerically why, but that's the idea, right? So you're thinking about the better game, you're getting at a lower price, but you're kind of paying more for that less attractive game, okay? So I'm selling, it may not even be that I earn more money, potentially I earn the same amount of money, but I just now sell more tickets so that I do have that full stadium and I can earn higher revenues in other markets. Okay? So some examples I always give of this, you know, we see it a lot of times, college teams do this, where they know like, actually, there was, I forget who it was now. There was a college football team that did this. Like, if you wanted, say, I'll use college basketball. If you wanted a IU Notre Dame game ticket, right? You also had to purchase. You had to purchase within that bundle a ticket to IU and I don't know. Who do I want to pick on? I don't know, IPFW or something like that, right? Some school that people didn't really care as much going to that game. So the other one that a pretty good example is these big rivalry games. So like the Cubs White Sox, they'll often sell like a combination where you get a Cubs White Sox ticket, but also a Cubs Reds ticket. You're purchasing a bundle of 2 tickets because, well, historically the Reds haven't been great and people don't kind of purchase as many tickets for those games. So the idea is you're taking one attractive, one less attractive product, and you're bundling them together. Okay. So I'll try to give you, here, what would I do when I do stop share here? There we go. So let's think about if I had a consumer and there's 2 games. So we could think about this as the Cubs White Sox and the Cubs Reds games. So let's say the Cubs White Sox game, maybe this person would be willing to pay up to $150 for that ticket. However, for the Cubs-Reds game, they'd only be willing to pay up to kind of $50, right? So if I set, so this is like the person's marginal benefit, right, to both these games. So let's say the ticket price is set at $75. Right? Well, I would pay up to $150 for this game, right? So would I buy the ticket for $75? Yeah, it's way less than how much I would be willing to pay. However, for this game, I'd only be willing to pay $50. So do I purchase a ticket to that game? No. So here I would have the quantity of tickets I sell is 1. Think about the kind of revenue I bring in here. I only sell 1 ticket for $150. No, sorry, I didn't sell for $150. I only sold it for $75. So, you know, it could be that even in this situation, I continue to raise my price up, and maybe I even go as high as charging a price of $150. But if I continue to raise my price here, I'm still only ever going to sell that 1 ticket. However, if I look at this, so let's say that's what they do. Let's say they increase the price all the way up to $150 so that they're still selling 1 ticket, but total revenue is $150 now. Well, what if I bundled those games and said the price for that bundle is $200? Well, how much does the person value both those games combined? $200. So would they purchase that ticket? Well, its marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit up to that point. So you think about now, I'm selling 2 tickets, and kind of my total revenue here that I'm earning is now $200. Right? Now, you could argue that, you know, potentially if I was able to set prices differently for these 2 games, you know, I still could kind of get at this idea by doing some variable or some dynamic ticket pricing. But this is just another strategy. Right? This is just another strategy that you're using. Okay? And I kind of made the prices somewhat realistic or make sense here. You can imagine, like, if there was just a game that like nobody wanted to go to, such that you're thinking more, maybe it's more like 150 and like $2 or something. Well, when we play this out, you'd see you're able to kind of increase the quantity a lot more if this price differential would kind of widen. I mean, at some point, like I can't charge $2 for my tickets and sell them separately. Sell this one for $2 and sell this one for 150. It's not really probably a very great look for my team. I probably don't want to do that. It probably more attractive, look better optically. I wanted to say optimally, and that was wrong. It would look better optically if I kind of bundle them together, because then people don't really see that I'm only selling a ticket for $2, right? It's kind of packaged in there. You can't directly see it. So bundling would be preferred to variable ticket pricing if the value someone would pay for one of these really bad games just got really, really low to where it was like, it's a bad PR move to sell tickets to my games for $2. Right? So that would be kind of the benefit of bundling there. But you can kind of see, just with a very simple example like this. And I talked about it as though it was an individual consumer, like a person valued at 150 and 50 for these different games. This could just be the equilibrium price of each of those games, right? Well, if I know the equilibrium price of each game, then the equilibrium bundle price, it would just follow the same procedure, right? I would look at the equilibrium price for both games, add them together, and then sell the bundle for that, okay? Any questions on that? Does that make, I know this, hopefully you can read this okay. I know it's a little bit light today. Okay with that? Okay. So we will pick up, we'll do some more, I'll go a little more detail on price discrimination. We'll talk about some different pricing strategies. And then, well, actually, sorry, we're not going to do this Tuesday. This will all be in the video that I filmed. I'll kind of walk through the majority of the rest of these slides. I'll get that video up this afternoon once I get back to my office. And we'll kind of pick up wherever I leave off in that video, pick up there on Tuesday. So next week, the 19th, why is that date important? Does anyone remember? So that's the date that I want you to have, I believe that was the day set, for your proposals, right? The thing that start thinking about those project ideas. I know a lot of you got some ideas to me. I have a lot of your data sets started, but not completed yet. So I'll try to keep working through those and should be sending some of those out next week. I'll also probably look for an email, because for a few of you, I've identified some data issues that we might have to slightly change it. So I'll start sending those emails out now that I kind of have the starts of those data sets to get you something you can start thinking about using for that final project, okay? All right, and there's no reading for this week, but in the video I post, I'll probably go over a paper and start to think about how those papers will have a format similar to what your project should have. Okay? All right, we'll end it there. I'll see you guys on Tuesday. If you have any questions on the homework as you're working through it, feel free to email me. I've already had quite a few in-person or Zoom meetings with people, so feel free to reach out. All right.